Hello and welcome to Cambridge and Washawn, a new podcast all about two guys' obsessions, passions, and hobbies. And those two guys are me, Mark Bagley, the host of Wake Up Heavy.
And me, Ronald Zarigian, the creator of content on the Skelevator channel on YouTube.
Today is the first episode, so we'll go through introducing ourselves individually and also how we know each other. And then we will hit some childhood obsessions of ours. Ronnie, give us your history.
Yeah, I should have introduced myself as Ronnie, because really that's how we talk to each other.
That's what I call you. Apparently everybody else calls you Ronald.
Well, those people aren't important today.
That made me think of knowing people growing up who had names and or nicknames. Like, you know Andy Davey.
Yeah.
And he can kind of go as either Andrew or Andy. We had another friend in high school who was always Andrew. Like, I couldn't see calling him Andy. And I asked him, I think once later on after high school, I'm like, does anybody call you Andy? And he's like, nope. And I'm like, okay. So I was right.
I won't call you Marky Poo, which I called you before. Yeah, that's fine. So, I'm Ronnie Zarigian, Ronald Zarigian, or Skelevator, depending on where you know me from. I have a YouTube channel that I started right before the pandemic called Skelevator, and our daughters convinced me to start it because I was making these dioramas or these models of play sets that were based on Masters of the Universe play sets. And then it quickly evolved into like a toy review channel. There's also a talk show on there that I have with my pal Oz and my other pal Bobby called Toy Frenzy. And we talk about primarily Masters of the Universe stuff over there. Mark and I have known each other for a long time, so he knows the whole history, but to keep it as brief as possible, I've got a master's degree in creative writing, so I write poems, and Mark and I bonded over Bukowski years ago. I make art. I'm a painter. I have my bachelor's degree in fine art, and so I have a background in visual art as well. I have lived off and on in Fresno and rural areas surrounding Fresno. And so I have a little bit of that in my background as well. I grew up in the mountains and I grew up in the city. I have those perspectives behind me. The wife and kids, we live here in Fowler, which is a small town in the Central Valley. So I get to see Mark every once in a while, which is cool. We're both obsessive people, so we often bond on these things, and that's why we're here today.
I don't know how much I get into this on Wake Up Heavy, which is my other podcast that I started in, I believe, the summer of 2018, Wake Up Heavy Recollections of Horror. So it's mainly about horror movies, and it started as an exploration on horror movies that affected me as a kid. So stuff from around this time that we'll be getting into, at least on these first couple episodes of Cambridge and Washawn, and then later. And then it's evolved into newer movies that have hit me, or movies that I never saw when I was a kid and have seen since and were blown away by. We do occasionally venture out beyond horror movies. And so I think I'm up to about close to 130 episodes of that. I guest host on some other movie podcasts like the Projection Booth podcast and the Culture Cast. All of which, including this show, are part of the Weird and Way Media podcast network. Coming up will be the guest host of a limited series on the short-lived TV show Police Squad and the Naked Gun series, as well as we're going to kick that whole thing off with an episode on Airplane. That'll probably be coming out around the same time as this. If you listen to Wake Up Heavy and are coming over to this, you may have heard a little bit of this information before, but I don't get too terribly personal on there. I was born in Fresno, California, way back in 1969, so I am a Gen Xer. Have lived here all of my life except for 4 brief months in 1990 when I lived in London. That was for school, though, so I don't really count it too seriously, but it was a very influential time. Live here with my wife and daughter. Again, if you listen to Wake Up Heavy, you're familiar with her because she guests quite a bit on my show. I went to Easterby Elementary, K through 5th grade, and then Air Elementary, one of the magnet schools here, opened up in 1980, and I did 6th grade there and then went on to go to private school in junior high all the way through. Went to Fresno State like Ronnie did. Graduated from there in 1992. Oh, geez, that's 30 years ago.
That was when I was starting high school.
Yeah.
We've got a bit of an age gap, but
yeah,
that's never stopped Mark and I from bonding over things.
I think a half a generation lies between us.
Yeah.
We hit on a lot of things, and then there's things that obviously were big when you were younger, like Masters of the Universe, that I completely missed. Oh, and you kind of mentioned how we know each other. We met at one of the cafes here in the mid-90s, I guess.
Yeah, I think that was like 93 or 4. And I know it wasn't I still in high school, or was it, I don't know, maybe it was 95.
I think you were maybe getting ready to graduate, and I think I was at Normandy Village, so that would have been 93 or 94. So it was somewhere around there. Yeah, and one of us was reading Last Night of the Earth poems. And I can't read. You said it was you. I thought it was me because it had come out not too long before then.
Yeah, I have my copy right here, and it has a coffee stain on it. So I think I just assumed it was me. One of us, because neither one of us can quite remember, said, "Hey, you like Bukowski?" or something like that.
Yeah.
And you and I were pretty deep into Bukowski at the time.
At the time, yeah, very much so. Which you can hear all about on my episode on Barfly.
Oh, which is really a great episode, Mark. I think that episode turned out really great.
Thank you.
It's hard to look back on Bukowski, with rose-colored glasses, especially today. It's difficult to admit that you appreciate that kind of stuff in today's sort of situation that we're living in.
Yeah, we get into that a little bit.
I think you all sort of addressed it in an appropriate way, which is like, well, we've got to appreciate it for what it is, but also be aware of what it represents and what he kind of represents.
And hopefully we don't get into too much problematic stuff with the things we read. I guess it's always possible to pull back the layers on any of this stuff and find something not so pleasant.
There's so many layers.
So what is the first thing that you wanted to talk about?
I'll start with one of the big obsessions of mine as a kid, and it allows me to talk a little bit about my childhood a little bit more, which was, and you mentioned it earlier, you said, you don't really bring in your personal life experiences and Wake Up Heavy. And I don't really do that on the Skelevator channel. I incorporate some of my real life stuff in there, but I don't really get it. That's not really a venue for talking about who I am. So Star Wars is a great way for me to sort of begin this conversation and also explains how and why I get obsessed with things. And I think Star Wars is sort of the beginning of that for me. I grew up in 2 different situations. My dad and my stepmother lived in Fresno, and my mom and my stepfather lived up in the mountains. We had a Christmas tree farm up there. And I had 2 older stepbrothers. My first experience with Star Wars action figures was they were visiting, and we went out to the end of the driveway. It was a pretty big plot of land, and we didn't have a lot. But the few Star Wars figures that those guys had, we took out there, and I remember them tying a firecracker to Greedo and blowing him up.
That pains me.
No,
he's one of my all-time favorites.
Oh, man, me too. He is probably my favorite Star Wars action figure besides IG-88. We'll get into that. Greedo was my first love, and I don't know if it's because of that or not, but I never actually, I think partly is that after watching him get exploded, I never actually got one for myself. I missed the whole first Star Wars movie run of action figures because I was too young, but those guys did. They were on board with that. So I didn't really get to received Star Wars toys as gifts until Empire Strikes Back. And maybe that's probably why they were okay with blowing up figures, because by then they were kind of starting to feel a few years old. It really started for me with The Empire Strikes Back. The snow planet of Hoth. I would occasionally get snow up there where I lived. It was just the perfect scenario for playing with figures. I spent, this is probably giving away too much information, but I spent a lot of time alone, like in the woods, essentially. With who knows what was like, underneath rocks around me, rattlesnakes and what have you. I spent a lot of time just sort of like sitting in shallow creeks and climbing granite rocks and playing with the few Empire Strikes Back action figures that I had received as gifts. I feel like for me, gifts were a way of keeping me busy during those years. So I would take those figures out and play with them. And, it was really about, to shorten the story a little bit, it was about the bounty hunters. It was about IG-88, Boba Fett, Forlon, Zuckuss, and Dengar. And they were my prized possessions as a kid. I loved playing with them. I didn't get vehicles or anything until later on. Then after a couple of years, it really, Return of the Jedi hit, and then I just got really deep into wanting all of those super weird background characters and fell in love with Jabba the Hutt and all that stuff. But I would say that number one, my earliest obsession as a kid was The Empire Strikes Back, those action figures, wanting a Darth Vader, wanting a Stormtrooper, never being able to get them at that stage, never being able to find them. It was always the newer characters that I would get, knowing early on that the villains and the baddies and the weirdos were my favorites. Right from the get-go, I had some sort of genetic disposition to not be interested in Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia and Han Solo. Chewbacca sort of rode that fine line between good guy and super weird. I accepted him. But the others, I was really into those bounty hunters.
You brought up a couple things. I'll talk about my Star Wars stuff at another point. Again, older than you, so I saw those movies, in the theaters and had some of the early figures. So I'll save that for a later episode. But you bring up the point of the things that you didn't have, and that will become a through line for me on a lot of the stuff that's on my list.
Yeah, me too.
We weren't well off. When I was growing up, my dad taught. Since both my sister and I were young, we were 2 years apart. So when they moved here to Fresno, my sister was going to be two, I should say, because our birthdays are both in March. So we're 2 years and 6 days apart or something like that. My mom stopped teaching to raise us until I was in 6th grade and my sister was in 8th grade. Then she went back. She substitute taught. And there's a couple funny stories about that I'll probably bring up at some point in this. She substitute taught at my school, I think by the time I was in 4th grade and my sister was in 6th grade. But my dad would also do all these odd job type things like nursery business, landscaping, painting houses, a lot of stuff that I got dragged into when I was old enough to help to supplement income, tutoring. There's a very interesting story about his tutoring that I'll probably hopefully get to at some point too. One of the kids that he tutored is notorious in Fresno.
Interesting. I think it's fascinating you got to have some experience with landscaping. That's cool.
Oh, I hated all of it. Hated all of it. We'll get into that at some point. That it ties into one of my obsessions, actually. I'm glad I'm thinking about it. I'll have to listen back to these to refresh my memory about all the stuff that I'm now thinking of fits into some of these obsessions, because they're pretty good stories, or interesting to me at least. That whole idea of what I didn't get, and I don't think it's necessarily monetary, but a lot of it is. So for me, I grew up near Sunnyside, which is a very affluent area, actual Sunnyside in Fresno. There's a country club over there, big houses, a lot of mid-century modern houses.
It kind of used to be before they built the mansions over there on North Van Ness. Mm-hmm. Sunnyside used to kind of be Fresno's closest thing to Beverly Hills back in the day.
And it was close to a lot of the agriculture in Sanger and Fowler and all that. So a lot of rich farmers lived around there. And a lot of my friends at Easterby in my class lived in Sunnyside proper. A lot of them lived out by me. My best friend lived 2 blocks away from me. But a lot of them were definitely more well off. And I didn't really think about it much until later in life, realizing, when I went over to my friend Jason's house, he had all of the toys and figures that I wanted.
Yeah.
When I went to my friend Dirk's house, they had all kinds of stuff. Dirk's dad was a dentist. I don't know what Jason's dad did, but they had the coolest fucking house I've ever been to in my life. Mid-century modern.
Oh, amazing.
In one of the circle drives in Sunnyside, he had a tree house. They had like 2 side yards, so the house was built, sideways in a lot. Wonderful, huge swimming pool. Got really fun stories about being at his house. Yeah, that longing for existed for a long time. Later in life, when eBay comes around, and we'll get into all that later on in these episodes. I'm not going with toys, I think, this first time. I'm going to talk about some of the books, the reading, I guess, old things that I became obsessed with as a kid. And I believe a few of these I have brought up from time to time on Wake Up Heavy because they've come up. But one of my first obsessions was Harry Houdini. And I don't know what triggered it. I think it was, and a lot of these book things relate back to Scholastic book. Yeah. I don't think we had book fairs when I was a kid at our school, but we got the flyers like all the time. And I would just pour through those flyers and look for things that...
The 5-page catalogs.
Yeah, and they filled out your order. Most of the stuff was pretty cheap. And then you waited until that shipment came. You got your books.
Glorious.
I love that day when they passed out the books.
Yep.
That goes into another obsession of mine. That anticipation and that waiting definitely had to do as a kid in the 70s. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't Amazon Prime 2-day shipping type stuff, which I love these days because that was frustrating to wait for stuff. So you'd fill out your order, give it to the teacher with the money. Your mom would write a check or give them cash or whatever. Who knows how long it took for those books to show up. But I think I probably was just intrigued by the cover image. And I think, because I did a little search, I'm like, what book would I have read about Harry Houdini back then? And I have it in my head that I read like a full-length paperback biography. And I may have at some point, but I did see a book whose cover struck my memory. And I was like, and it was a Scholastic book. I was like, I probably, if nothing else, at least read that short little thing first. And they still do a lot of those books. And when I've taken Cleo to book fairs or we see her book order, they have those little, I'm not sure what the size, they're a little different size than most paperbacks. And it's just a brief biography of famous people.
Yeah.
So I became really intrigued by him. And it wasn't really mainly the magic, although that was a big part of it. I think what struck me the most was his fervent work to oust spiritualists and mediums that were ripping people off, because that was a big thing at the time when he was alive. And that always fascinated me. And I think they kind of, in those books, got into what those tricks were, like how they would make instruments play. Like I vividly remember at one he went to, a trumpet kind of popped up and played on its own. And he would uncover all that and expose those people as frauds. That has gone on in my life where if a movie has a seance in it, it like automatically gets an extra half a star from me.
Yeah.
If a movie has someone debunking a seance, it gets a full star. And Amityville 3D does that at the beginning of the movie.
For sure.
One of the reasons I like that movie. So yeah, I read probably at least 2 or 3 books about Harry Houdini growing up.
I get the same sort of excitement from debunking of a fiction, of like something that is, if someone is trying to bullshit another person or a group of people, I love movies and documentaries that are about dismantling that illusion or that lie. I can see why you would be obsessed with Harry Houdini, or why he'd be resonant with you, because you are, I mean, I've known you for so long, I know that I can say this, that you're a fervent teller of the truth. Is fervent a word I just made up, or is that a real word?
No, it's a word.
It's weird. I heard myself say it and I was like, is that real? And so I can see why you would like that, because his tricks there was a kind of truth behind them, in that you could see, you were supposed to feel like you were seeing what was really happening. He's not trying to hide or trick you. He's trying to show you what can happen through endurance and education, really.
He was pretty tricky, though. A lot of his escape tricks were hiding a key in the back of his throat or something that he would pull out, cough back up, and get out of either a jail. He did all that. He would travel around the country and put me in your safest jail and I'll get out of it. There was a lot of trickery involved in some of those things, but something like the big trick of his, that water tank where he would hang upside down, which ended up being his demise in a way.
What I react to the most is how the trickery is not something hidden. It's like, I mean, it is something hidden for him, but you can see what's happening. Like, he always wanted to make sure the audience could see what was happening, as opposed to, here, I'm going to pull a rabbit out of a hat. I know it's a really bait thing. Like, the hat is black and it's felt and you can't see what's in it and you can't see what's underneath it. That's part of what I think makes him cool, is that he allowed the audience to watch as the trick was happening.
I think this was right at the beginning of the pandemic, and I don't know how it popped up into my feed on Twitter, but there's a fairly recent book that came out, and I saw it on there, and I was like, oh, Harry Houdini. This isn't an obsession that lasts forever. Like, I haven't read a book about him in decades. It's just always something, when I see a seance scene in a movie, I automatically go back to that Harry Houdini thing. So I saw this, and then I noted, I think it was like a retweet from somebody, but I noted the original poster. His name was Adam Begley. I was like, another Begley. And then I was like, oh, this is the author of the book, which struck me as just really odd. And so I commented on his post, oh, it's nice to see another Begley that was obsessed with Harry, or that's obsessed with Harry Houdini or something. And then I think he tried to pitch, make sure you buy a copy or whatever, which I haven't done, but I may do. And he's the son of Louis Begley, who's an author as well, wrote the book about Schmidt that Jack Nicholson movie is based on.
Yeah. I love that.
I always remember seeing, there aren't, as I've mentioned on this show, there aren't a lot of famous Begleys out there. So when you see one, you kind of latch on. Ed Begley Jr., of course, which I did a whole series on, Culturecast. But speaking of movies, I think I finally saw, and it must have been the Tony Curtis Harry Houdini film. I saw it at some point when I was younger, and it was kind of a disappointment. He'd led a very interesting life. One of the first, big superstars that ended up getting him into movies, which were still pretty new at the time. So he was in a lot of silent films. Then met an untimely death. It's kind of suspect as to how that happened. Supposedly, the apocryphal story is that a guy, like a football player, came up to challenge him because he was known for being really strong and muscular, and said, hey, let me punch you in the stomach. Houdini wasn't prepared for the punch, and it caused internal bleeding, but there may have been some underlying issue. That's all very fascinating. Then, and this comes up in a movie I just watched recently, which made me think about Houdini. The idea of, or not a movie, but The Midnight Club, the show on Netflix, where their intent, these are all kids that are close to death, and they are intent on proving, if there is actually an afterlife, I will let you know in no uncertain terms. And that was his pact with his wife. If there really is an afterlife, and if there is a way to communicate, I will figure it out and let you know.
That's amazing.
I don't know if he died or was born on October 31st, or if they just chose that as the date. Every year after his death, she would have a seance on Halloween to see if he could communicate. And of course, he never did.
Right. I think that's hilarious, darkly hilarious, that they would hold a seance, which is something that he was constantly trying to debunk.
But if anyone could do it, I guess his idea was he would. So what's up next for you?
Well, it's funny because and I know that we'll bond on this too because we've talked about it, but the Scholastic books is sort of what leads me to my next obsession, which started with, it's a multifaceted obsession. In other words, it has taken many different forms throughout my entire life so far. But as a kid, this book, I'm pretty confident I got it through a book fair, Movie Monsters by Alan Ormsby, and you've talked about Alan Ormsby quite a bit on your podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea who Alan Ormsby was, nor did I really care as a kid. It was all about this book.
I had no idea who he was either. Wouldn't have had any reason to. I don't think it's mentioned in the blurb on the book.
It's not. There's no mention of that at all. And you had mentioned that you had a copy of this too, I think.
Yeah, and I have one over here somewhere, but I'm sort of glad that you're the one doing this one because, as you mentioned, I've kind of talked about it already.
Yeah.
So I'm going to cross that off my list because I did have the Ormsby book on my list.
We can both talk about it. This book, it's called Movie Monsters, Monster Makeup and Monster Shows to Put On by Alan Ormsby.
You'll get the name right eventually.
Ormsby. Scholastic Book Services put this out.
Yep.
The edition that I have, I had to re-buy this edition. It's 1975.
Yep. Same with
I don't
me.
know what happened to my original edition. It was probably given away when my mom gave my toys to her elementary school students.
Yep. Toys, comics, and these things all ended up in thrift stores or God knows where. Thanks, Mom.
Other people's.
That's going to come up multiple times during this.
Yeah. It took me a long time to not be frustrated about that action.
I still am.
I mean, the rural community that I grew up in was fairly poor. It took me a while to figure out that her giving those toys to her students was probably very generous.
Yeah.
A very generous move, especially since most of those kids probably didn't have many of those things. And now to this day, every time I find a vintage action figure or an item from my childhood in either an antique store or a toy store, collectible store, or comic book store, I feel like I might be buying the thing that was given away that used to be mine.
Hey, you never know. You never know.
And so this version of Movie Monsters came from eBay. I read this repeatedly and religiously as a kid. I created the crafts that were described in here, including the Frankenstein paper bag head.
Lucky bastard.
Ben's Monster paper bag head, which was a challenge because this book describes a particular size paper bag that doesn't really exist.
Exactly, which I talk about when I talk about that. Because I could never do it. I'm like, these are way too big, and this thing does not fit over my head. And I have a small head, even to this day. It's probably about the same size as it was in elementary school. So, like, this motherfucking bag don't exist.
I know. I had to figure out a way to, jerry-rig a bag to fit my head, and that became a real challenge, but I was determined to try and make it happen. And I never put on a play because that idea just sort of annoyed me or scared me, maybe is a better term for it. I didn't get into like performance until later on in life. Well, I don't know how I did that, but even as a kid, I was shy about that stuff.
Yeah.
So I tried out all these special effects makeup tricks that are basically just DIY things. Yeah. Use what your parents have in their pantry, in their medicine cabinet, whatever you can find to make this stuff. It struck a real powerful chord with me. To this day, I'm an advocate for using things that are around you to make new things, as opposed to buying all of your art materials new. Use what you can find. And it led me to a very powerful obsession that still to this day stays true, which is the core Movie Monsters, Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, Creature from the Black Lagoon especially, and Dracula and the Bride of Frankenstein. Those particular characters have always been very emotional and positive energy in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I can trace it back to this particular book. I had this book before I'd even seen any of the classic Universal horror films. And so I had this at a very young age. I didn't start watching those until they popped up on what was called Action Theater. You've talked about it on, it was on Channel 26. It was Saturday afternoons, right after the cartoons. It started around noon, I think. Yep. And they'd show kung fu movies, and they'd also show horror movies.
Action theater could be westerns or horrors. And then at some point they actually changed to kung fu theater when it was almost... And that was probably because, and that was in the 80s, a lot of those Shaw Brothers movies were bought up for syndication. And so these stations that were probably all owned by the same company had access to all those Shaw Brothers movies. And it's like, well, let's start showing these on Saturdays. And they still showed horror movies. It just kind of depend on the weekend, I think. I mean, that's a whole other that's a whole
other box of chocolates.
We'll get into that.
Yeah, for sure. I remember distinctly when they made that shift. I was a little disappointed, to be honest with you, because I just really, they even showed some Hammer films.
Oh, yeah. I got a story about that, too.
Yeah, there you go. That's when I first saw Curse of the Werewolf, which is Oliver Reed, which is a phenomenal. This led me toward that obsession, which was with the Universal monsters and making stuff at home. And like I said, and this is not a sob story, but I spent a lot of time alone just making stuff or exploring and building forts and just by myself. And so this allowed me the opportunity to put on costumes and pretend even away from Halloween and get into finding ways to express myself, not just in my mind through play, but also in a performative way, which allowed me to break out of my shell a little bit as a kid. And so it really helped me in a multitude of ways. Then I got really obsessed with, and this, again, still to this day, special effects makeup. When I was in middle school, it was my career choice. It was is what I wanted to do. I was reading Fangoria magazine and I was watching all those movies, and not for jump scares, not for anything like that. I was watching it for the artistry of the gore, the monster effects, the latex, the animatronics, and all that stuff. And I don't think I would have been as interested in that stuff if I didn't have this book as a youngster. That's sort of like a multitude of categories stem from this book. I mean, Rubber Masks, Starlog magazine, and Fangoria magazine, and Cinefantastique magazine. And my dad really taught me to appreciate film, and he taught me about horror movies. He showed me some horror films and cult films as well. He was really into that stuff, which was cool. But I don't think I would have been as interested if I didn't discover this book. It's still strange. I think it was a book fair, but I don't know 100%. I may have even rented it from the school library or something. I don't know, because our school library had some seriously cool books in such a small little community. And monsters, you remember the Orange series of hardbacks? And they were each one was about a particular monster. I think they were scholastic too, but so I would check those out of the library. And I don't know how I got a hold of this book, but it changed my life in a very, very cool way.
I had the same story. I don't think I attempted any of the makeup in here because I wanted to do the Frankenstein one so bad. That was the one that looked the coolest, and just could never find that bag that I think he just invented so that he could create that in the book.
Yeah.
It was all very interesting, though, and you have to point out, though, when you talk about this book, just how charming the illustrations are that he did. That's what always struck me. I would look at it just to appreciate the illustrations. They're amazing. Even the simplest makeup things in there, like the Dracula one, which is basically just making a widow's peak on your forehead. Never even attempted those. The Jekyll and Hyde thing is brilliant, which they actually do in that film. That trick of lighting with, if you've got red makeup on your face and you have a red filter over the lights, it's not going to show up on film. Once you pull that red filter off and put a blue filter on, which you can do in a black and white film because no one's going to see that light change. There's a movie, I see this clip at least 2 or 3 times a year. I think it's called The Octopus, and I think it's a foreign film, an old foreign film. And there's this woman, and she starts cackling maniacally, and then her face does that change where it just gets all dark and wrinkly. And I'm like, that's the exact same effect.
Yep.
And that's how they did it. It's so much more effective to me than stop motion like they do with the werewolf, to apply all the hair. It's more effective to me that it happens literally in camera. Wolfman stuff happens in camera, but you're using stop motion techniques to film that frame by frame. And to see something like this where they didn't make an edit, it just happens on screen, is still fascinating to me.
Again, I think that goes back to you and your fascination with pulling the curtain away, seeing the thing happen. I'm saying that because I'm the same way. It's so cool to see it happen.
And yeah, I feel the same way about that. I haven't really given that much thought, but that's probably also why I got interested in those things too, the special effects, and why horror movies, particularly The Thing, where you're going like, how in the world did they achieve all this?
Mind-blowing.
Finding out later on, basically every shot is a completely different setup that required completely different tools, and you just think about the defibrillation scene in that and how many setups they had and how many changes in the prosthetics and things they had to complete that task. It's amazing.
Even to this day, that particular scene, when we watched it with our daughters, they experienced it for the first time. It was shocking for them still to this day.
Oh, yeah. I think Cleo is still pretty blown away by it.
Even in this world, like special effects that are supposed to be hyper real, digital animation, it's like nothing comes close to that tactile stuff.
And you also mentioned not really knowing if it was a book you bought or checked out of the library. And I'm the same way. And I may have mentioned this in an episode previously on Wake Up Heavy. I probably did. I want to say that I checked it out from the library. I don't know if I owned the Scholastic copy myself. I know that I saw it in the catalog. So it's like, did I end up buying it? I don't know either. Again, when eBay came around, it's one of those things that popped into my head to look for.
Yeah.
Took me until I did those episodes on Ormsby and Clark to actually hunker down and buy one. $10 or something. Probably when I first started looking for it on eBay, probably could have gotten it for $5, but $10 ain't bad.
I think I got mine for about $5. So I was surprised.
I might have actually bought it on abebooks.com, but I don't remember now. So my next session goes along these same lines. Did I get this from Scholastic? Did I not? I don't know. And I have mentioned this on Wake Up Heavy a number of times, but I was obsessed with The Elephant Man. I don't know where that came from. It could have been one of those short biographies in the Scholastic catalog. I don't know if they had a book like that. I might be conflating this with the Harry Houdini stuff, but I'm pretty sure for this, I read 2 different books about the Elephant Man. And I believe that one of them was the biography that Frederick Treves wrote, which is the basis of the David Lynch film. Think about it off and on. Did I see the movie first, or did I know about this person and read these books prior? And I want to say, sort of had a light bulb moment the other day where I was like, I remember sitting in a theater and thinking, oh, they really got this makeup correct. Mm-hmm. So I must have had the books because they had pictures of him in the books. Could be a false memory, but I want to say that the books came first. The interest in him came first. And again, I would have to say it was either from a Scholastic catalog or a lot of my discoveries just came from the library itself. Either the school library or the Sunnyside Library, which is where we went a lot. Yeah. I checked out a lot of books from the Sunnyside Library. And that'll come up again and again because a lot of the different things I have on here, I'm like thinking, I checked that out of the Sunnyside Library. That corner of Kings Canyon and Clovis Avenue was our hub for shopping. There was, I think it was a Vons. We had an Alpha Beta right by our house, which we did most of our shopping at. But I think once Vons moved in over there, we would go there a lot. Even before there was a big grocery store there, we would go to the library, to Christensen's Market, which was in the same corner, and our Me and Ed's Pizzeria was there. So we would go there for Me and Ed's either after baseball games or baseball practice or just whenever we wanted pizza. There was this fantastic fruit and vegetable stand on Kings Canyon, just a little west of Clovis Avenue, that we went to probably all at the same time. Hit the stand, go to the library, go to Christensen's, get all of that shopping done at the same time. And later on in life, that's where the video store that I would go to was, just down the strip mall from Vons. That's where McDonald's was. So when we got our McDonald's, that was a treat. When I would help my dad do yard work, that's the McDonald's we went to. Javier's was there. All this stuff. That was really our central location for most of the things I did up through high school, really. I know that I read a couple of books and was just extremely fascinated with this life that this guy led in Victorian England. Was really excited when that movie came out, and I went to go see it with my friend Scott Christensen. Strangely enough, lived right behind that Christensen's Market. They weren't the family that owned it. They lived on Park Circle Drive in Sunnyside, really cool house. He was one of those kids that had a lot of the toys that I never had. Mm-hmm. I don't know why we went to see it. I don't know. It didn't come out around my birthday. It opened in like October of 1980. I know why I wanted to go see it, but I don't know why he and I actually went to go see it. I may have just...
You probably convinced him.
Yeah, just like, come along. Who knows? He probably absolutely hated it. I remember just like bawling like a child during numerous scenes in that movie. You know, when he's being attacked. Apparently a lot of this stuff didn't happen. A lot of the worst stuff that's shown in the movie didn't actually happen to him, which is nice to know, but is still kind of like, why did you manipulate me that way? That was also the first movie that made me genuinely interested in the Oscars, because I remember making it a point, since it was up for the Big 8 nominations, and I was absolutely gunning for that movie to win everything it was nominated for.
Yeah.
And I didn't know David Lynch from Adam at that time. Probably heard Eraserhead pop up or read it in articles about The Elephant Man. Wouldn't see that for a number of years. But I wanted him to win so badly. I wanted the movie to win so badly. Yeah. And of course, that was the year of Ordinary People, so it lost out to that. I think in most categories. May have won for makeup or something, I don't know. Or sound design or who knows what. That movie, I rarely return to these days because it hits me so hard emotionally. I think the last time I watched it was a couple of years ago, and it's just like, I can't do this very often. It still really devastates me. And then my friend was probably just going like, dude, what's the problem? Why are you crying?
Who's Mark? I don't even know who this kid is anymore. That's an important film because it was my first experience with David Lynch too. My dad must have shown it to me. I don't know how I could have. I wasn't interested in the true story behind John Merrick, right? Or is it? Yeah, John Merrick. Yeah, I can't wait for us to do a David Lynch episode because there's just so much to talk about there. And I know for both you and I, David Lynch has just been a thread, a constant thread. So there's a lot to talk about there.
As far as he's concerned, I remember being struck by those Lynchian touches. Or there aren't that many, but the dream sequences were very fascinating. And then when the movie opens, Anthony Hopkins is performing a surgery. All of the equipment looks really weird. And of course, I understood, this took place 100 or so more years ago, 1800s at some point. But I remember thinking, it's probably just because of that. It's so old. But I think when I look at it now, it's like probably really picked some odd stuff to have in the surgery room as just, a Lynchian touch. I mean, I liked surreal stuff even back then, although I probably didn't know the term. That's why Tourist Trap stuck out to me.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So much when I saw it. It is very surreal, phantasm, all those things. That would come a couple years later, but still not having a phrase or a term for that. What that kind of imagery does, I just knew that I liked it, and always have and still do.
What stood out to me about Elephant Man was, as you mentioned it before, the sound design.
That too.
I think that's where, aside from it being black and white and there being a few moments visually where we were stricken by Lynch's style, in Elephant Man, it's the sound design that really shows through. You could see David Lynch, he's thinking about the auditory experience of watching this film early on.
Well, that's a through line from Eraserhead on. I mean, he probably loved it because it's industrial age England, so you can have all that machinery sound and steam sound, and it was probably a very loud city at that time.
Yeah, for sure.
That was like good. This is right up my alley as far as sound goes, because that's what Eraserhead is all those industrial sounds, just layered and layered and layered.
My third thing that I picked to talk about today now feels out of left field, because I feel like in many ways the creatures of Star Wars, the Harry Houdini book relating to the Alan Ormsby book and the weirdos and all that stuff. Now that I'm saying out loud, and then John Merrick, of course, now that I'm saying out loud, maybe it does relate. My other obsession as a young person was the Muppets. My experience with the movie Monsters book is similar to my experience with the Muppets. By the time I got really interested in them, they were no longer on prime time. And the only time I could see an episode was at 4 o'clock in the morning when it aired on television. And my dad was generous enough to take them on video cassette. I didn't get to actually watch many episodes of The Muppet Show, but I had seen the Muppet movie in the theater. I didn't really get to start watching the Muppet Show until later on, but before I started watching the Muppet Show recorded on video cassette, I had the Muppet movie in my mind. I was more interested in the puppets themselves, or the Muppets themselves. It goes back to the whole Ormsby thing, which is, make it yourself. How are these things made? How can you make something like this? And so we would go to the Reedley Library, which is about the size of the room I'm sitting in right now. A super small library. It's in between Fresno and the foothills where I lived. We would go to the Reedley Library often because we had relatives in Reedley. I would beeline it to this one section. It must have been crafts or something, but they had a book, and I still can't find it. I've looked on eBay, I've looked everywhere. It's been an ongoing obsession. My memory of it I could be mixing up several different books. There was a How the Muppets Are Made book, essentially. The humor, I didn't even care about the performances. I didn't care about who these characters represented or the entertainment aspect of the Muppets. It was really just that these super weird characters, the monsters especially, were made out of material that seemed to come alive. It was like foam and carpet, essentially, and ping pong balls as eyes. And I just love that there were people putting their hands in the cloth objects and making stories, giving life to these inanimate weirdos. So the Muppets were, and they still are to this day. If a new Muppet thing comes out, I get really excited in a visceral way. In fact, I have this really strange... So there are certain songs, pop songs, that would come on in the 80s. One of the Tears for Fears songs in particular reminds me of the Muppets, which is really strange. It's like every time I hear that song, and I can't remember the title of it right now, every time I hear that song, it reminds me of the Muppets. Every time I smell a permanent marker, a Sharpie, I'm reminded of the Muppets, because I used to draw them obsessively with Sharpies. When my mom taught elementary school, she'd take me to school early. I'd get out a piece of paper and start drawing with the permanent markers that were there, and it would be either Universal monsters, Star Wars characters, Masters of the Universe, or for an extended period of time, it was Muppets. So now I associate those smells and the occasional 80s pop song to memories of the Muppets. And I can't really explain how or why, except for the fact that those songs were on the radio, and I was doing a lot of drawing with Sharpies while I was interested in them. The Muppets were, and I kind of studied the Muppet movie for a period of time after high school. It was my first experience, aside from like the re-releases of the Star Wars films. Rewatching the Muppet movie was my first experience really with diving back into trying to grasp onto a nostalgic feeling. Muppets will always be a nostalgic gateway drug for me.
I watched The Muppet Show when it was on, and that it started in 76, so I was 7. I remember watching it. Of course, I had also watched Sesame Street, so I was familiar with a few of them. I think by the time the show ended, I was already too old for it. That was around when I was 12. I don't recall seeing any of the movies in the theater, and I still don't think I've seen most of them. Mm-hmm. We watched The Muppet Christmas Carol, I think last year. I don't think I'd ever watched that before in my life. So at some point, I threw them aside. Once that show ended and I was 12, and a lot of stuff stops at 12 or 13 for me, which we'll get into later, along with getting rid of comic books and toys and all that stuff as we cast these things aside and then later regret it. As I look over, I've got the Sesame Street Lego set. Their design and imagery still really strikes a chord, and I have I thought I had it laying out here somewhere, but I have a little Ernie plush that I got because Bert and Ernie were sort of the big ones for me as far as Sesame Street. So I have a little Ernie plush that I still have, so that survived from childhood. But the things I remember were the hand puppets that they made. I know they had Franklin. I want to say they had probably Bert and Ernie and Grover. Grover was one of my favorites. So they were the head was hard, like a really thick vinyl. Yeah. And they came in a pretty large box. So it was head, torso, and arms. Yes. I remember seeing them in grocery stores. Oh, yeah. In particular, Franklin. Never had one of those. But again, one of those things that I used to see all the time and kind of go I sort of really want one of those. But I don't know what I would do with it because I wasn't into doing puppetry and stuff. The design of them was fascinating. I do remember, though, having the Fisher-Price Little People, and I think these were hand-me-downs. I don't think we bought these because they were random ones. Actually, I don't even remember which ones we had. I just know that there was a set, again, of the street with the buildings, and probably similar to the Lego set that I have. You had all these different characters. Big Bird, Oscar, Cookie Monster, all these and those little wooden, not the fat, chubby, gross plastic little people that they have now, but the little wooden ones. And then when they did go to plastic, but they were still that smaller shape. I also had finger puppets, and these are... Oh, I had the Grover one. Things that I still look for. I am really tempted to buy on eBay. Thanks for reminding me. I had Oscar the Grouch. Oh, man. And maybe one or two others of those finger puppets. I don't know if those were bought new or if those were also hand-me-downs. Those I remember, and those are things that pop up every once in a while in my head, and I do eBay searches for, and save in my cart and never buy, and then they get sold or just get unlisted. And at some point I'll probably get an Oscar the Grouch because that was the one that I remember really enjoying. I had the Grover finger puppet. I'm glad you brought it up because those were amazing. I had a few friends that had the Sesame Street Fisher-Price figurines. I think they were left over from older siblings, and I just remember seeing them at their houses and always wanting them. Another friend had the Oscar the Grouch. It was Fisher-Price who pumped air into the trash can with a little hand thing. The head would pop up out of the trash can. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever. So I'm glad you brought up Sesame Street and reminded me, because I'm 99% sure that
it was Sesame Street that led me to the Muppets, and I just stayed with the Muppets. I'm the same way with the Sesame Street characters too. Like, they strike a very powerful chord with me. I see Big Bird, I see Oscar the Grouch, I see Grover in any form, and I'm taken back to those years. We have on DVD the early episodes of Sesame Street, and I remember even as a kid that they would rerun those. My appreciation for Sesame Street is those early years as well.
Any of the characters that have the big red nose are what I liked. I was always fascinated by the nose, and every once in a while one would get pulled off of somebody on Sesame Street. I loved it.
There's one episode where Kermit, I don't remember how this works. Kermit is either a dentures salesman or someone is a denture salesman, and Kermit ends up with dentures. And it was the most terrifying scene. I found it on YouTube about 5 years ago. I haven't rewatched it, but it took me years to find that clip, and it's still terrifying. The frog with dentures.
I'm trying to decide what to go, if I want to just stick with books this time and save everything else for later. I don't think I owned this book. I believe it was strictly school library checkouts, and it was the Alien picture book.
Oh.
So would have come out in 79. I would have been in 5th grade, and there is absolutely no way in hell that my parents would have taken me to see Alien.
No.
These picture books, and they'll pop up a couple of times. I have still, I believe, the Dune picture book.
Nice.
That's basically the same thing. Pretty simple synopsis of the story with tons of pictures.
Yeah.
And they were oversized, like folio-sized books. I'm pretty sure this is something that I did not own because I don't think my mom would have appreciated it. They weren't real restrictive on things, but I think I always had that fear, like, oh, if I took this home, my mom would say, take it back or whatever. I think it was school library. It might have even been classroom library. I don't know. I just remember always being at my desk when I looked at this thing. And so I knew most of those big images from the movie with very little content. I don't even know if I read the text of the book. I think I just looked at the pictures. And the things that really struck me were Ash, especially when his head gets knocked off.
Absolutely.
The chest burster, which I'm pretty sure they show. I don't know if it's, it was, I think, geared towards kids. So I don't think it was too terribly graphic.
The alien phenomenon is so weird.
Or maybe they just didn't understand it and had it in the library and didn't really look through it like they would today to comb to find any secret messages about inclusion in any way or something like that. But yeah, I mean, there was the toy, the giant Kinner toy. It's not a kid's movie in the least. I just remember looking at that book constantly. I don't know when. I mean, it would have been at least 3 more years before I would have seen the movie, maybe even more. But once video stores started popping up, probably watched it at the same place where I watched most of the other horror movies I saw when I was that age, at a family friend's house, who's one of the sons my sister ended up dating for a good while, and they had a VCR and were even closer to the Sunnyside video store that we would go to. A lot of those movies were first watched at their house. So it was probably then. Boy, I perused that book so many times in 5th grade.
What's interesting is that I think I saw Alien for the first time when it was broadcast on television. I mean, this is the era that we lived in. Like, they showed it, an edited version, of course, but they showed it.
That's a possibility. That is, that's definitely a possibility, too.
That's also how I saw The Exorcist.
Yeah, I saw The Exorcist for the first time on TV. I want to say that they promoted it as uncut, but I really don't think the crucifix scene was left in. But I remember being really freaked out by that, like jumping up and actually hiding behind the couch. So I was probably like 12 or 13.
It was one of the scariest experiences I ever had. I was at my aunt's house, and I was, 8 or something. I think she just put it on because I said I wanted to watch a scary movie, and it was on TV, and she just left, and I was there watching it myself. It scared the you-know-what out of me. But yeah, that's funny you mentioned Alien. I don't think I saw it on video cassette until years later. The first experience was that edited version. I have that on my list too, Alien, as an obsession too. It led me... we went to visit one of my dad's friends, and he had the Kenner Alien on his coffee table. Alien and toys is a strange relationship because I feel like it was the first new release toy that adults could collect too, because it was an R-rated film. It was a scary movie. There's a toy that's made for kids that adults wanted to have, and they had it too. I think I had a version of that book too as a kid. It's almost like it's an Alien movie. Kids who like Star Wars will probably like this too.
I think that's what they were gunning for. I don't know how successful it was.
You look at the face hugger, you look at the H.R. Geiger designs, and then you watch the movie in its entirety, and it's so perplexing that and then eventually Predator would become toys for kids. You watch that first Predator movie too. It's like gory. It's one of the goriest films that I'd seen.
Alien isn't really all that gory when you think about it. I don't think that the Kenner figure was much of a success. You couldn't at the time market things to adults as collectors. When you look at the old ads, it's a kid playing with this huge 18-inch Alien figure that's out of scale with everything. I mean, I guess if you have Migos or G.I. Joe, it's sort of in scale. But it's out of scale with most other things. Definitely out of scale with 3 and 3/4 inch figures. Yeah. I don't think a lot of parents were willing to get this for their kids. I don't even know when I discovered that there was an Alien toy, because I didn't know about it at the time. I probably would have been interested in it just because of the book.
Yeah, for sure. That figure is definitely on my list of things to find.
I don't ever recall seeing one, though, like in the wild or anything.
So. No, me neither. Just on my dad's friend's coffee table.
Well, I think that's good for a first one.
The only thing we haven't talked about is why this show is called Cambridge and Washon.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so why is it called Cambridge and Washon, Ronnie? Because that's not our names.
It's not our names.
It's not our pseudonyms. It's not our nom de plumes.
It took us a long time to figure out what to call this thing.
Yes.
And it makes sense to us that it'd be called Cambridge and Washon, because for a good period of time, you and I both lived in the same apartment complex, which was basically a converted mansion, I guess.
Could have been. I mean, it's so close to Fresno City. It could have been student housing.
I guess it could have been built as student housing.
But it was probably a big house. It was probably just a big 2-story house.
In the 1920s, perhaps. Maybe it was built. Essentially, it was an apartment complex of studio apartments. You lived there first.
I lived there first. Got kicked out because I was using a space heater. Well, and there's a good reason for that.
I forgot it.
Because I was working most days then. I was substitute teaching at the time, and was working a lot because my mom was still teaching, and so I would work for her and for many of the other teachers at her school. That was at Faulkner. I mentioned Air earlier, and they were built at the same time. It was the same building.
Yeah.
So it always used to kind of trip me out when I would go there, because it was set up exactly the same as Air, and there's a couple other schools like Malik and other schools here in Fresno that were all built with the exact same design at the same time. I guess to make things simple, I don't know. I mean, I guess it makes sense. When I moved in, I was like, the heater doesn't work. When you move in somewhere, all this stuff is supposed to work.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Of course, winter doesn't last forever here. That problem would go away until the next winter. So I lived there at least during 2 winters, because I know it wasn't an issue for as long as I was there. But whenever it got cold again, I was like, I give you the landlady there was ancient. She was super, super old.
Yeah.
A foreign gal. She had a heavy accent. I'm like, please have PG&E come out and fix this. I have no idea how to fix it. I don't know what's wrong with it. I keep trying to light the pilot light. They do that. I am giving you permission because they aren't supposed to go into your place when you're not there, which she apparently did anyway, because how would they know that I was using a space heater?
Absolutely.
Every time PG&E would come out, I wouldn't be there.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, please let them in and show them the heater and have it fixed. Or I'm going to keep using my space heater because I'm not going to freeze to death. So I got kicked out for that.
That was too much trouble for old Agnes. I think she was German.
I moved out. I don't know when you moved in, but you moved into where I had lived.
Yeah.
Since I got kicked out, I didn't have anywhere else to go. Went back home for a while. Then I ended up at the Flaming June house when Dan moved out.
Yeah.
And then your sister was going to move out, or her and her boyfriend. I don't remember what the deal was, but she was across the hall from you at the time.
Yeah. So, I moved in probably 98, I think. She moved in shortly after because there was a vacancy. She didn't live there for very long, maybe a year.
You know what? Actually, she was there when I was there, across the hall.
Oh, that's right. Okay, that's right. She helped me get the apartment. That's right.
Yeah, and then she left because I'm thinking, like, wait a minute. I know that she was there while I was there, so this story isn't making sense.
That's right.
Then she left, and then because other than the space heater, Agnes realized that I was a good tenant.
Yes.
I got allowed back in, and I moved in across the hall from you where your sister had been.
We lived across the hall from each other for a little bit there, a couple of years.
So I was there, I think, 98 through late 99. That's when Carlene moved in, and then we moved into a bigger place.
That's right. And I was there until about 2000. I moved out shortly after you moved out, I think.
The place was on the corner of Cambridge and Washon Avenues in Fresno.
If anybody listening is ever driving through Fresno and you're in that Fresno City College area, there's a big pink building on the corner of Cambridge and Washon. And the apartment I lived in was Mark's old apartment facing the street, facing Washon. And then your apartment was on the other side.
Yep.
Your later apartment was on the other side, across the hall.
It was a fun little place. There were some weird goings on, but not terribly bad. My car got stolen from there a couple times, and
it was not the best place to live, but it was certainly Lynchian. I'd say it's Lynchian.
I liked the second one better because it had that big, huge built-in bookcase that someone had put in at some point. So all of my books actually had a place to go.
Yeah.
While it was just me, it was perfect. Going to bed in the same room that you're doing everything else in always appealed to me in a way, and still sort of does. It's
an ideal scenario for a person living on their own. A studio apartment is great.
Like a hotel room all day long.
Very much so. A lot of fun memories there. Like you said, it was super weird too. That's where Mark and Ronnie movie viewings began, really. Back when you were just living there, and then eventually when we were both living there, we would watch movies.
I distinctly remember watching Jackie Chan movies with you and your little brother.
Yeah. That's right. Jake, my little brother Jake moved in there too.
He was really little though at the time, or much younger than you. So he was with you, and you guys came over, and I had I still have it. I have like a 3, or maybe it's 2 tapes, Jackie Chan set of movies, which I haven't watched in probably since I moved out of there.
Fantastic.
I don't even remember which movies were on there, and I don't know if that was a gift from somebody or if I bought it.
That's why this show is called Cambridge and Washon. That's where we spent a lot of fun time together, and where a lot of these discussions that we're going to currently be having in the future here sort of stem from.
Yeah, we need to go put a plaque on there.
That's right. No one will notice.
Mark and Ronnie lived here.
That's right. That's right.
And now you can listen to their podcast on weirdingwaymedia.com.
That's right.
Well, do you want to give a preview of what we'll be talking about next month? And this will be a monthly show. I don't know what day of the week it will be released, but for those that have caught this first episode, it will be monthly. So this isn't going to be coming out all that often, and we may have, so keep your eyes peeled for this, we may have a video companion portion where we, if we have them, the things that we're discussing, like the Ormsby book, you and I both own copies. Some of the other stuff we'll probably have to mine the internet for pictures of. But as things get further along here, we will actually have the physical items that we're talking about for a lot of this.
Little video preview episode.
We'll have, hopefully, a video companion on Ronnie's channel. And so there will be links for all of that, or we'll let people know via our own Instagrams and things when that's available. When and if that pans out. I'm kind of hoping it does.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about, and it's the same for movie podcasts, you're talking about a visual medium, but this is all auditory, so you're missing those things. But, feel free to look up all the stuff that we've mentioned. Do you want to give a idea of what you might bring to the table next time?
Well, goodness, we have a lot of options.
Yeah, I still have a whole crap load, and I was adding stuff as we were talking.
There's 2 things that I have on my list that, actually there's several here. There's like a whole slew of things. You and I could talk about Hitchcock, we could talk about Stephen King, we could talk about McDonald's Land, we could talk about Garbage Pail Kids, we could talk about Popeye the movie. That's on my list. Popeye the movie. There's a ton of things we could talk about for the next episode. What do you have in mind?
Probably do a couple more book-related items, because that was a lot of, in elementary school, a lot of what I was into revolved around books of one kind or another. And so that may start veering me into comic book territory. And that's a topic that will run throughout, I think, a lot of these. But a couple of maybe oddball things that I experienced via comic books. One story in particular that I'll get to eventually, which is on my website currently. I kind of love this story. Not necessarily comic book characters or Marvel or DC, but things that were sprinkled throughout comic books. Yes, monthly, look for the show. Please hit Skelevator, and we'll have links for all of our other ventures. So Ronnie's YouTube channel, my show, Wake Up Heavy, the From the Files of Police Squad show, which will be coming out around the same time as this. We'll have links and all that in the description for this episode and on our social media pages. So I am at Wake Up Heavy on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and Letterboxd, and Linktree. Ronnie, where can people find you?
I've got a Skelevator link tree that'll take you to the YouTube channel, to my Facebook page, Instagram. If you're going to go on Instagram or Facebook or YouTube, Skella_Vader is probably the best way to find me. Also, you could find my art Instagram, which is Ronald Zerigian_projects. And Zerigian's tricky. It's DZERIGIAN. So it's RONALD, and then another D, Zerigian_projects. There's lots of good stuff out there. It's been fun talking to you, Mark, and doing this new venture with you. I'm so glad that we decided to do this. This has been a blast.
Oh, and the music, by the way, that will open each episode and close each episode is from Ronnie's band, IG-88, which was around when? What years were you guys active?
My gosh, 96, I think. 1996. I was in a 95, 96.
So I definitely knew you then because I saw many of these shows.
Mark went to many of the shows. We were like a 2-person experimental punk band called IG-88, which is funny because that's the first thing I talked about today was my obsession with Star Wars action figures, and IG-88 was a figure that Matt, that was in my band with me, he and I agreed that was one of the coolest action figures, so we named the band after that. IG-88 is the name of the experimental punk band you heard at the beginning and here at the end.
And we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.
All right, bye.